Everybody, thanks for joining us here on rotocurve.com for weeks 13 college fantasy football on DraftKings and FanDuel, the early slate edition. Interesting week this week, obviously, with the Thanksgiving holiday. So I want to wish everybody a great holiday. Hope you had a lot to eat and saved a little bit for today. A lot of games on Friday, so hopefully you checked out Josh and Brian. Almost a full slate on today, which is pretty nice. And then also coming back, basically the last full week of the regular season of college fantasy football coming up this week. So this is going to conclude our video series for the season. But definitely be sure to check out Josh and Brian doing their thing every single week during the bowl season. We might come back and do a bowl season special video just to kind of give you some strategy and tips on how to handle it. But for the most part, the bulk of college fantasy football season does conclude this week. So want to thank everybody for joining us this season. Hopefully it was a successful season as it's been over the last 3 or 4 years if you followed what I've been doing in the daily fantasy community. So appreciate all the support. And let's get into Week 13's early slate for this Saturday. And like I've been doing, we're going to go ahead and post this worksheet over on rotocurve.com in the college fantasy football forums. So you'll be able to download this and then adjust the lines as they come out over the next day. So like we like to do is, kind of highlight some of the teams and the games that look to be attractive, high point spreads, high totals, where we got some high scoring games, etc. So let's go ahead and sort that for you. And, you kind of see here that Memphis SMU looks to be the top game that you want to focus on. Yes, the line is 21.5. However, with a total of 72, that does get minimized a little bit because we do expect this to be a pretty high-scoring game. So, both teams should be, pumping out a pretty good pace here, Memphis and SMU. And the good thing about it is this game is on both sites, so you can take advantage of it. That is one of the things that you're going to have to look at this week for sure is that, unfortunately, there's a couple of very attractive games this week that are only on DraftKings. And so it's a little bit disappointing that they're not on FanDuel because it does lessen the player pool. It's definitely a challenging week. Just kind of talking about the landscape, not a lot at the quarterback position and not a lot at the wide receiver position. It's just a very tough slate to handicap. You have a lot of low-scoring games, a lot of teams that are going to grind the ball out. Again, there's no real plays for me that really jump out except for possibly, Derrick Henry at Alabama, who you got to imagine is going to be getting the ball quite a bit, especially on the Heisman campaign. And, you're definitely going to want a piece of Memphis, SMU, Indiana, Purdue, Cincinnati, East Carolina, and maybe a little bit on the Clemson side, although not as high on that game as maybe some people. But really and truly, I mentioned these top 3 games, and 2 out of the 3 are not on FanDuel, so that makes it tough. If Indiana, Purdue, and Cincinnati, East Carolina were listed on FanDuel, I think that would have made the week a little bit easier from a handicapping perspective when you're talking about daily fantasy. But we'll do the best that we can and identify some of the plays that we like. So Memphis, SMU, big game. Indiana, Purdue, Indiana has really been a team that you can definitely take advantage of. Now, the situation with this game is you have to keep an eye on the running back situation because right now Jordan Howard is a game-time decision. If he doesn't go, Redding is the backup, and so he becomes very attractive. I know on the Purdue side, there's a couple guys that I don't mind. Again, they're projected to get 31 points, and this looks to be a pretty high-paced game. So, from that perspective, I think that, there's definitely opportunities in this game. But again, DraftKings only. Cincinnati, East Carolina, same deal. This line is jumping around a little bit. Actually, East Carolina has actually jumped over and is about a 1-point favorite, but it doesn't really impact, what we're trying to do here. High pace, should be a lot of throwing, a lot of offense. So definitely want to target some players in this game, and I definitely have a handful. North Carolina, NC State. Now, the thing about NC State in this game, North Carolina, we know, has an elite rush attack. The problem is North Carolina State's got a pretty good run D. And I know last week I talked about how I was scared of North Carolina possibly getting upset by Virginia Tech, and that almost happened. And so I'm not sure if that's going to happen this week. I think, Clemson and North Carolina look to be destined to play. in the conference championship game, and that's going to really determine, who goes in the top four. But in this spot, with it being a rivalry game, I definitely can see NC State hanging around. I don't think they have an opportunity to win, though. So I do like North Carolina, but I'm not in love with anybody on the fantasy side in this game. I don't mind Elijah Hood, but again, with the NC State run defense being as good as it is, I think that's somebody I'm probably going to jump off. USC UCLA should be a close back and forth type game. The problem that I'm having is on both these quarterbacks is they never really have monster games, and you're having to pay a pretty good premium for these players. They never have a bad game, so the salary doesn't drop enough, but they never have these breakout games where I feel like they're going to be able to win you in college DFS. So a lot of people were on Kessler last week and really got burned. So to me, there's an opportunity for a couple players in this game, but I'm not on the quarterbacks. West Virginia, Iowa State. A lot of people are going to look at this and say high total, high pace. You got to have a piece of West Virginia's air attack. The problem is you really need to have because of the defense, everyone's going to automatically assume West Virginia is probably going to try to throw the ball in this game. The problem is if you look at the game logs, West Virginia is not throwing the ball. The last 3 games, they've been running. I don't see that changing. I think that they're going to stick with what's working. And it wouldn't shock me if this game actually goes under the total. I know a lot of times you see a game in the 60s and, with a high pace. But you got to remember, these are stats that are being compiled over over the entire regular season. And you do have to still look at game logs over the last 3 or 4 weeks, which is something that I do. And again, West Virginia is really heavily, been heavily focused on running the ball. And I don't think that's going to change here. I think they're going to continue to keep the ball in the hands of Smallwood and Shell and grind out wins because that's what they've been able to do. And Skylar Howard probably at this point is not a quarterback that can win you a football game, but he certainly can lose you one. So I think that's kind of where West Virginia's game plan is coming in. Clemson, South Carolina, obviously a huge game for Clemson, continuing to stay undefeated. They're favored by 17 in this spot. South Carolina is going to play slow it down, where Clemson is going to try to speed it up. So that does devalue Clemson a little bit. I think with the quarterback landscape being so thin, it's really hard to get off of Watson, although I do like Watson much more on DraftKings. On FanDuel, it makes it very difficult to get everybody in because you're really having to scrape if you pay up for Watson. Again, you can do it, but just be aware that you're going to have to, sacrifice in a couple of spots in order to do it. If you got Joe Williams, you can do it at running back for Utah. If you've got a cheap tight end, like the tight end for Louisville, I think there's an opportunity to get Watson in with a decent running back. Again, no huge studs at the wide receiver position this week, and nobody that you're going to have to pay crazy money for. So I think that you can do it. Ideally, you'd love to try to get Watson and Henry and then just roll with the rest of your lineup, and hopefully those 2 guys carry your lineup. Again, this is a challenging week because there's just not a lot of premium plays on the board. So when I have a slate where there's not a lot of premium plays on the board, what I tend to do is just go for the top shelf guys and then really dig deep and try to find some value, especially at the wide receiver position. Give me consistency. I tend to overlook matchups a lot when it comes to this type of slate. I'm not so much concerned about matchups where I'm really looking at value and volume. And is a guy going to get me a certain, what is he doing the last 3 or 4 weeks from a target perspective? Has his salary really reflected that? Has he been playing in tough matchups over the last 3 or 4 weeks? And what has he done against weaker teams? That's something that you're going to be able to exploit. So, again, some of these Big Ten teams, going against really tough defenses, whether it's Michigan, Michigan State, Penn State, Iowa, there's some elite defenses in the Big Ten. But, when these teams have a tendency of going outside and playing against other teams that aren't maybe as elite on the defensive side, it may present an opportunity. So it's just something that you want to consider. It kind of goes in line with an Indiana and Purdue type of situation. And even though Wisconsin's pretty good on defense, I think Minnesota's got an opportunity this week to present some value. Again, it's a close matchup, so there could be opportunity there. Louisville, Kentucky, not a lot in this game. that I'm looking at. Again, when we start talking about these teams that I don't have highlighted in green, there's not a lot that I'm looking at in these games. Low totals, high, very low pace games. Outside of Utah, Colorado, where I think the running back for Utah is still definitely in play again this week because of his price point and the fact that when they ran Booker had the most carries of anybody on a per game basis in college football. So you got to imagine they're going to continue to stick with that game plan. Alabama, the run game, of course. Georgia, I think Sony Michel is probably somebody that you can look at. Not an elite guy, but somebody that you can probably look at in a tournament. Ohio State, Michigan, I'm probably not going to take anybody in this game. Again, like I said last week, when I was worried about Ohio State, Michigan State being a grind out, slow, lower scoring type of game, that's exactly what I expect here. I think it could be even lower scoring than what it was last week in terms of Michigan State, Ohio State. Michigan absolutely motivated in this game. Ohio State may have a little bit of a letdown, even though if they win, they could get back into the top four, but it wouldn't shock me if there's somewhat of a letdown, especially with the Ezekiel comments. Of course they're going to try to feed him, but let's see if they can actually, get something done. Would not shock me if Michigan wins that game and kind of ruins Ohio State's season. Michigan State, Penn State, going to be a very grind out type of game. So nobody that I'm really looking at in that one. Wisconsin, Minnesota. We do like Alec Erickson pretty much every single week. He's a consistent wide receiver. This game is going to be a pretty low scoring game and grind out, but I think, Erickson. And then on the Minnesota side, I think May is a guy that you can look at based on his recent production and his price. I think that, again, when we're talking about wide receiver in college football, it's a very inconsistent position. I try not to rely on guys that are TD dependent, very touchdown dependent. I want consistent targets week in, week out. Now, if a guy's getting consistent targets week in, week out, but he's never going to get in the end zone, that's somebody that I'm probably not going to look at. So an example of that would be Nelson Spruce from Colorado pretty much gets 5 to 6 catches every single week. The problem is he gets 60 yards and no touchdowns, so he never returns value. So that's just not somebody that I can consider playing in daily fantasy. But there's some other guys that definitely have better consistency and just a little bit more upside. But a guy like Spruce, it's very hard to take a guy like that because, again, he's got a low projected total as far as his team goes, going against a pretty good defense, and just even though he's been consistent, his floor is so low that he's just not somebody that I'm going to consider. So let's look at the quarterback position. We'll look at the salaries on each site, and I'll give you some game notes. So, I think it's very obvious, much like last week, Deshaun Watson out of Clemson is the top guy for this slate. Now, he's priced at 10.1 on FanDuel, which is tough. I still think you can make it happen. But if you're going to go Watson, Henry, it really makes things tough. You've really got to go Watson, Henry, Williams, and then super cheap at some other positions. You can do it, and I don't have a problem with it. But, again, just be aware that there's going to come some risk with it. Now, it's really hard to get off of both those guys this week because they're so far ahead, above anybody else in their position. So that's really why I keep mentioning that strategy. Watson's 8-9 on DraftKings, which makes him very attractive. The game notes on Watson, pretty much, he's thrown the ball 30 times or more in his last 7 out of 9 games. He's averaged around 285 passing yards his last 4. He's getting about 80 yards a game on the ground his last 5. So, again, an elite quarterback in a rivalry game. Now, South Carolina could slow this game down a little bit and make things a little bit difficult in terms of just slowing it down and not allowing Clemson to play at that high pace. So I do like him more on DraftKings, where I'm only have to pay $800 more than Lynch, whereas on, FanDuel, I'm looking at a pretty big spread of around 2,300, between, that's why Lynch is so attractive on FanDuel and Watson is more attractive on DraftKings because of the salary. Now, the thing with Lynch is last week, he was pretty much my top cash game quarterback because of his consistency all year. Temple was able to shut him down. The game was on the road. And, it was really tough to watch Lynch have such a bad game because right now he's projected in some spots to be the number 1 pick in the draft by the Cleveland Browns, who desperately need a quarterback. So this guy is definitely motivated to continue to have good games. Now he gets a pretty good matchup where he gets SMU, who's actually ranked 119th on defense for opposing a passer rating. So Lynch, who has been very efficient all year and had the worst game of his season last week, I'd come back to the well and I'd go with Lynch again. And, he had a streak of 275 passing yards in 9 games snapped last week. I think he gets back on that. And, again, SMU's defense is one of the worst in the country. So Lynch could absolutely be a guy coming back in, getting 300 to 350 and 3 touchdowns. And at 7,800 on FanDuel, definitely somebody I would consider. In the same game, Matt Davis, SMU, you got to imagine that they're going to throw quite a bit. And in this spot, Davis has 5 300-plus passing games this year, and he's rated number 13 with passer rating. So really good quarterback in a good spot and a good game. So Matt Davis is a guy. Now, he's more of a tournament play for me, whereas Lynch is more of a cash game play because of the consistency and the fact that Memphis is a heavy favorite. So SMU quarterback Matt Davis, more of a tournament play or a second quarterback option for me this week. Now, these next 2 guys are DraftKings only and tournament only for me. As far as, maybe second quarterback as well. If I'm going with Watson or Lynch, I don't have a problem going with Keel or Sudfeld. I think I feel more comfortable with Sudfeld. I think Keel, even though the differentials say he's got a good matchup, I think that the ECU pass D is perhaps a little bit better. If you look at some of the other underlying metrics, ECU's pass defense may not be all that bad. It's not one of the bottom, it's mostly middle of the pack. So again, Cincinnati, good passing offense. Again, if Keel is healthy and he plays, he's been good this year. So he's 7,200 on DraftKings. He's had 5 300-plus games, along with Sudfeld, who's only has 6,400. So I think that when you're paying $800 less, I think Sudfeld, to me, represents a better value. Again, 5 games of at least 300 yards passing or more. He's in a high total game, and he's going against a pass defense that he should be able to exploit. On the running back side, we're going to give you 6 guys. Derrick Henry, Alabama. He's priced pretty up there, obviously, on FanDuel and DraftKings, 9,300, 9,100 on both. I think you absolutely have to try to find a way to get this guy in. 200 yards rushing and at least 2 touchdowns in his last 3 out of 4 games. I don't even worry about the last game where they played Charleston because that game really doesn't count. He didn't play. So, look at the games in which he's played. This guy's an absolute beast and really has passed Fournette as the number 1 running back in college football right now. So I don't have a problem paying up for Henry. Joe Williams, because of the injury to Devontae Booker, you still get him at a cheap price. You got him at pretty much minimum salary last week, so he does jump quite a bit. But again, until he hits around 7,500, 8K, you gotta continue to play him. Booker had the most rushing attempts in college football before he was injured, so you know that Williams is going to get the Brock 20, 25 times, and he's 6K on FanDuel, 5.3 on DraftKings. Mike Warren, Iowa State, is a guy that we played early in the season, and when he was first breaking into the lineup, and he was super cheap. Now you get him on FanDuel only this week at 6,200. Pretty good tournament play for me. He's got 15 attempts in his last 9 games, so you know that he's locked in for carries, and he's getting 6 yards a carry pretty much. So he's a guy that should get 100, and hopefully he can get a touchdown and give you some value. I'm not sure if the upside's there in terms of, can he go off and get 200 yards rushing and 3 touchdowns like Henry, and even when maybe a guy like Williams, but I think he's pretty solid, and he's a guy that I don't have a problem using in a tournament because, maybe more people are going to be on Williams, and he's a guy that you can fit in. Wayne Gallman out of Clemson, he didn't play last week. He was banged up, but it looks like he should be in play this week. 6,800 on FanDuel, 6,600 on DraftKings. He's had 6 100-yard games this year. When he's healthy, they do give him the rock. Again, not huge upside on this guy, but really solid, steady guy. And if you're looking at a second running back, especially on FanDuel, that's somebody that you definitely want to plug in. Wendell Smallwood, somebody that we've been using pretty much all year when he's got great matchups. He's all the way up to 8,000 on FanDuel, so I don't like him as much there. So he would be a tournament play only for me. On DraftKings, he's at 6,700, so you can absolutely play him in a cash game. He's got 7 100-yard games this year. Again, the only issue with Smallwood is that they do use shell quite a bit as well. But when you're getting him at 6,700, especially when you got 2 flex positions on DraftKings, I really like to load up at the running back spot. So I'm definitely going to try to get in, Gallman, Williams, Henry, And then the wild card this week pretty much is Divine Redding. He's going to be DraftKings only. If Howard doesn't play, and right now he's listed as a game time decision, I'd be surprised if Howard plays. He's been banged up the last few weeks. He got hurt early on. He burned everybody last week. So I think Divine Redding out of Indiana is a guy that you absolutely can look at, especially on DraftKings, because that's really where he's only in play. But when you have the two running backs and the two flexes in your cash games, that's somebody that you can definitely look at. At the wide receiver position, I'm not really recommending any of the top guys, so to speak. You'll notice that there's a pretty big omission here, and I don't have Juju Smith on my list. Too inconsistent, too high priced, and just a guy that I think have been burned on too many times this year. So I don't have him in play. What we do have is a group of wide receivers this week that I really look for consistent receptions and targets and yardage. You see the game notes. These are all, I'm looking for guys that have been consistently getting the ball week in, week out, or recently over the last 3 or 4 games and represent pretty good value. To me, Isaiah Jones out of East Carolina is at 6,300 at DraftKings only. 8 games of 6+ receptions and 75 yards. So to me, he's been pretty hot lately as well. So I do like Isaiah Jones at that 6,300 spot. Artavis Scott from Clemson, he's more attractive on FanDuel at 5,300. 6 receptions, 8 games. The problem with Scott is his yards per catch are extremely low. So, he's got some limited upside, and Clemson at times can spread the ball around so much that it's almost like Scott just doesn't get the volume, and his ceiling is just so limited. But as far as cash game goes, if you're paying up at the quarterback position and the running back position with Henry and with Watson, at 5,300, you can do a lot worse than Artavis Scott. So that's really kind of where that play comes in. Shaq Washington out of Cincinnati, got him at 5,900 on DraftKings. 6+ receptions in at least 8 games this year, and 70+ yards in at least 7 games this year. So again, we're looking at consistency. The worst thing that you want to do in college fantasy football and DFS is lay duds at the wide receiver position. We talked about that last week. I gave you some pretty good guys that came through. You just can't afford to take duds. You can afford to take floors and be okay and hopefully hit upside on the quarterback and at least one of your running backs, but you cannot take zeros and duds at the wide receiver position. I think you're going to see more and more emphasis on this moving forward, especially moving into next year, depending on what happens with college fantasy football from a daily perspective. But if we still have it next year, I think there's going to be heavy emphasis on, not spending as much at the wide receiver position, especially in cash games. It's just too risky. It's not like the NFL where you can actually pay up at the wide receiver position a little bit more right now. It's just they spread the ball around so much, and some of these guys are so touchdown dependent. Jordan Payton's a guy I've been loving and been using him for several weeks. 6,300 on FanDuel, 6,000 on DraftKings. He's got 100+ yards in 3 out of his last 4, and 6+ receptions in at least 8 out of his last 9. So great matchup, and he's been consistent and good. Alex Erickson's a guy I've been talking about every single week on Wisconsin. Again, limited ceiling, not a lot of upside there, but he's got 9 games of at least 70 yards. So that's somebody who, again, when you're looking to plug in value, you don't want to get zeros. That's a guy that won't get you 0. It's a little bit of a, kind of a premium play this week, and I think it's mainly because he's really been lost in the shuffle because South Carolina's offense has been so bad. He was so good last year. As Pharaoh Cooper, he's still 6,900 on FanDuel, so more of a tournament play for me. 6,400 on DraftKings. He's got 5 games of 100 yards or more this year, and he's got a touchdown in his last 5 out of 6. So I think he can get 100 and a touchdown this week. And if that's the case, you're getting an additional 3 points on DraftKings along with the 1-point PPR. So he's got a lot more value there than he would on a site like FanDuel. Couple of DraftKings only plays, guys, that we've talked about. Simi Cobbs has been consistent. He's still only priced at 4,400. You want a piece of the Indiana passing game. This is the guy that you want. He's got 100+ yards in his last 3 out of 5, and at 4,400, that represents pretty good value. Chris Moore and Shaq Washington have been solid at Cincinnati. Chris Moore's at 5,800. Not really talked about as much as Shaq Washington, but do like the value here. 3 out of his last 4 games, he's got 100+ yards and 5 touchdowns in his last 4 games. So if you're playing in a tournament and you want to do a Cincinnati stack with Keel, Washington, and Moore, that's going to be the direction you're going to want to go. And then the last guy it's really hard to ignore, even though the matchup's tough, but the production's been there, is KJ May from Minnesota. He's 5,300 on FanDuel, 4,400 on DraftKings. He's got 11+ targets in his last 4 games and at least 94 yards receiving in his last 3 out of 4. For an offense that's not known for throwing the ball a ton, mostly known for running the ball, is and at that price, again, if I'm looking going cheap at the wide receiver position because I'm loading up on Henry and Watson, I got to go Scott, Erickson, and May. And I feel pretty comfortable that those guys won't lay duds and at least give me, opportunities to break even. At the tight end position, again, FanDuel only. This is a guy who, when he pops up on the board, you absolutely want to, usually every year there's one tight end in college football that kind of emerges and becomes an absolute beast. Now, if for a while it was Tyler Higbee until he got hurt. But Jalen Samuels at NC State is all the way up to 5,300. And you might say, wow, why is he so much more expensive than pretty much any other tight end? Because you really never see a tight end over 4K. They use him as a running back and a tight end. And he's got 14 total touchdowns on the season. And he gets about 75 total yards per game. So that's why he's at 5,300. And he's actually justifies paying that kind of price. Because the upside's there, and he's going to get. You figure he's going to get a touchdown and 70+ yards. Right there alone is 13. Now that's his floor. So you have an opportunity of maybe double-digit 2 touchdowns and 100 yards. Now all of a sudden that puts you at the 22 range, not including the points for wide receiver, for the reception. So pretty crazy with Samuels that he could actually hit value at 5,300 still. In the game this week. There's 3 other tight ends. Bucky Hodges out of VTech at 3,800. I'm not in love with him, but the tight end position is pretty thin. If you still want a guy that's productive, he's not as consistent as Samuels, and you are paying a little bit more. So again, Hodges is a guy I'm not thrilled about, but we got to put somebody in the spot. I think there's a couple of value guys at tight end this week on FanDuel that maybe not a lot of people are going to be on. Or could be lower owned. A lot of guys are going to pay up for Samuels, and that's about it. And Bucky Hodges is a name. But Brandon Lingdon out of Minnesota, we talked about KJ May. So Lingdon is only 3,100, and his last 3 games, he's actually got 15 catches for 266 yards. So he's been a pretty big piece of their offense, and his price tag isn't really reflected. So I think Lingdon is a guy that not a lot of people are on and could definitely give you some good value. And then the other guy is Cole Haikutini out of Louisville. He's only at 2,400. He had a pretty good game last week. The thing is their starting tight end, Mickey Crum, is suspended. So, anytime that you're looking for a cheap tight end, you got to look for any kind of angle, whether it's an injury, whether it's suspension, whether it's demotion, and this guy gets plugged in. You've got to take advantage of it because it's not really it doesn't really happen very often. So if you're looking for the cheap tight end, I think Cole Haikutini is the guy this week because of the suspension to Mickey Crum. That's going to wrap it up for this week, Week 13's early slate on DraftKings and FanDuel for college fantasy football. Again, I want to thank everybody for this season. It's been a successful season again, and hope everybody had a profitable one. College fantasy football is not easy, and it's a game of information. So hopefully we'll be able to give you the best information that we can in the industry. And again, check us out Saturday morning from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m. in the chat room. Any late breaking news, we're going to be able to cover and let you know how that impacts your lineups. Thanks again, guys.